Hello, class. This week we will be exploring a little of creativity and its correlation with intelligence, as well as variability with gender. To begin, though, I would like to talk a little bit about a unique psychological phenomenon known as synesthesia. Now, for those of you that know, synesthesia is an unusual neurological condition where people can see, hear, smell, or feel a sensory stimuli of a different source. For example, seeing sounds, feeling music, tasting colors. Now, the research on this has been very interesting. What we found is that the usual wiring associated with synesthetes is located on the angular gyrus of the left hemisphere of the brain of these synesthetes. They seem to have a unique location that is combining the sensory information to create this unique sensory experience. Now, there's an interesting thing about synesthetes that is compared to the general population. They are statistically speaking, they are 7 to 8 times more likely to be involved in creative careers than the general population. And it seems that part of the reason for this is that they have this unusual wiring that creates extra connections to sensory experiences that makes for a much more unique and rich sensory experience, as well as a stronger associational experience. Now, if you recall, last week we spoke a little about metaphorical thinking and the ways that sometimes our mind is looking for similarities and patterns between experiences in order to come up with creative solutions. Well, here's an interesting thing. This angular gyrus region of the left hemisphere is an association area of the brain, and so it seems that there is an extra gifting of associational metaphorical thinking that is associated with this kind of synesthete experience. In fact, some researchers have identified this angular gyrus of the left hemisphere as the very seat of metaphorical thinking. Now, I find this completely fascinating, and I hope that you keep in mind the reality that we learned last week, that in order to be a successful creative thinker, it isn't just about having creative thinking, but the ability to move between normal, logical, sequential ways of thinking and the creative thinking, using both in the creative process, in the creative pursuits of finding that balance of the demands of the world and the demands of the creativity as part of that, of the entire process of being a successful creative. And so you need to move back and forth and have those associations, but also be able to be logical and sequential at times when it is needed. So, just an interesting thing that I wanted to bring up about synesthetes. Now, on to this week's main focus, where we will be exploring intelligence and a little bit about the role of intelligence in the creative process. So, naturally, in order to talk about intelligence, we need to define what intelligence is. So, the researcher Robert Sternberg's definition of intelligence is the ability to shape, select, and engage with environments. And others will define intelligence in a more general way of being able to solve problems efficiently. Another way that researchers have conceptualized intelligence is to break it into crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is that static body of knowledge that we have to work with. And fluid intelligence is the ability to engage a new and novel situation and navigate through it. Both are seen as equally important in living life and survival within life and through the evolutionary history. Now, research has shown that there is a correlation between memory and attention and memory and generalized knowledge. And so has been a movement in the history of evaluating intelligence to identify there being a kind of underlying general intelligence that can be identified as just roughly generalized in some ways as our IQ. And so we'll kind of use IQ as kind of the standard here as we discuss things, where we take our mental age versus our chronological age, essentially, in order to come up with a number. And the average for the population, the average score for the population for the IQ is generally considered to be 100, with 2 standard deviations below the mean being a score of 70 and 2 standard deviations above the mean being 130. Incidentally, the average university Harvard student would be considered in that 130 range. And so you would be considered a mentally deficit individual if you had an IQ score of below 70, and you would be considered very exceptional with an IQ of above 130. In fact, most astronauts are at that range of around 125 to 135 as an IQ, just as a matter of reference. Now, the researcher J.P. Guilford is someone who has been very well known for work with convergent and divergent thinking, has suggested that creativity is in fact a subset of intelligence. Now, within this way of thinking, intelligence is divided up into something known as operations, which involves both convergent and divergent thinking. There is also a content dimension, which includes behavioral and semantic information that is stored, and there is also a products dimension, which includes relationships, transformations, systems, and implications formation. So in a sense, then, in this model, creativity is the ways that we use the subsets of intelligence. And there are some that argue, though, that creativity is not necessarily the same thing as intelligence or a subset of intelligence, but rather that creativity and intelligence are overlapping sets. That there is some commonalities between the two, but that they are in some ways distinct. So, you could, in essence, have intelligence without creativity, or you could have creativity without intelligence. But when the two converge, what you have is an intelligent creative, otherwise known as a creative genius. So, for example, Catherine Cox did research on 301 geniuses that lived between 1460 and 1850. Now, what she did was estimate their IQ based upon a number of biographical factors. Now, what she did was estimate their IQ, and their early IQ as being between 155 and 165. And this would seem to indicate that these geniuses, these creative geniuses, demonstrated a clear overlap between intelligence and creativity. Now, looking at more modern creative scientists, Rowe did a study and found that those theoretical creative scientists had an IQ of between 125 and 190, with a mean IQ of around 160. So this is extremely rarefied group. Now, what this suggests is that in order to be a successful creative theoretical scientist, you need not only intelligence but creativity as well. And not only creativity but also intelligence. You need both in order to be a highly successful, creative, theoretical scientist. Now, in other studies looking at profoundly gifted students that were followed from age 13 into adulthood, and what they found is that this very, very rarefied high IQ people had a number of creative accomplishments. And within one particular study, it highlighted that there was 11 scientific publications, 4 inventions, 7 creative writing publications. And this is evidence, this study suggests, that IQ and creativity are correlated throughout the IQ scale. But if you look at it, this might not necessarily be the case. Now, I've taught classes where I've had more accomplishments in the classroom than in this study. And so there might be some other factors going on there. But I do want to draw attention to this because this study has been used at times to identify a direct correlation between IQ and creativity. Now, the model that I think is best, that best demonstrates the relationship that we see between creativity and intelligence, is actually what is known as the inverted U model. That is, there is an ideal point at which intelligence activates creativity to its maximum potential, but that then, as intelligence becomes more narrow and more extreme, that correlation begins to fall off. And so there comes a point at which IQ is essentially too high in order to be creative. And this is likely, I would suggest, because of societal effects that impact how a extremely high IQ individual functions. Well, why might this be the case? Well, the researcher Dean Keith Simonton points out that if someone has extremely high intelligence growing up, there is less motivation to develop creative thinking processes. They are so good at thinking conventionally. It comes so easily to them, and they are so quick at it that they get high reward early on in life. And because of this lack of struggle, the inevitable challenges of life that nurture creative thinking is not fostered. So, often what you see is the ultra extreme high IQ people are not creative because they've never needed to be creative. Instead of needing to think creatively to struggle through something, they are rewarded highly for thinking analytically because they are so gifted at it and therefore do not develop that part of their divergent ways of thinking that may allow for great creativity as well. So, two of my most esteemed researchers that I consider when thinking of creativity are Dean Keith Simonton as well as Shelley Carson from Harvard. And they both consider this inverted U model to be the best representation for understanding the relationship between intelligence and creativity. That as intelligence goes up, so does creativity to a critical point at which IQ, as it continues to rise, sees a drop-off in creativity. And that's likely because of this societal life experience impact that has taken place. So, the inverted U model is likely the best way of understanding the relationship between intelligence and creativity. Now, let's move on and explore a little bit of gender and the nature-nurture debate within creativity. Now, as I've already mentioned, Dean Keith Simonton is a preeminent researcher, and in his book, Who Makes History and Why, He relates that only 3% of the world's most notable creative achievements were done by women. And so the question should be asked, why is this the case? Now, when you look deeper into it, Simonton highlights that most of these women are notable largely because they are of noble birth or associated to someone powerful through marriage. So they have resources that most women do not have, which is striking. And Simonton also highlights that it's probably the one area where women have excelled the most is in the area of creative writing, primarily because it has not been dominated by men, and there are not high resource barriers to it. And it's easily, a woman is easily able to hide their gender to a publisher by simply having a different name. And in so doing, he highlights that there are some systemic barriers that have caused women to not be at the top end of creativity in science or in things like music or art. First off, you do not need expensive scientific equipment or musical instruments in order to be successful at creative writing, whereas the other pursuits require significant resources in order to find significant scientific achievement. And so it seems there are some systemic barriers that have limited women's achievements in creative pursuits. And it isn't necessarily that there is a difference in the creativity between men and women, but only that the access to the resources required for exceptional success within the fields is different. Now, let's look at both the nature-nurture side. From the nature side, some evolutionary biologists will argue that it has been advantageous for males to be the creative ones in the pursuits. And as such, males are just more creative and are wired differently than women. Now, when we look at the research, though, and people like Shelley Carson, for example, did some research at Harvard where she looked at comparisons of males and females and intelligence, and there seemed to be, based upon her research, no noticeable difference. It was a slight statistical difference, but it was not significant between the intelligence and creativity of males versus females. And this is fairly current research. And so it does appear, from the face of it, that we need to chalk the limited high C creativity that we see within societies to a lack of systemic limitations upon women, limiting how much access to resources they have, the resources that are required to fully reach that significant level of contribution, both in the sciences and in the arts, to creativity. And I expect that in the not too distant future that 3% contribution rate will change significantly. But I will say that in the research that was done in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that contribution rate of 3% did not seem to change significantly during that time. But there seems to be no better explanation at this point for the limits to women's high C achievement of 3%, except for that systemic limitation that has been placed upon women and access to resources. And so, it's my hope that as we move from the present into the future, that these limitations are being removed, that there exists today nor in the future no more limitations that separate males and females, because we are all better off as a species to benefit from the creative pursuits of all, citizens of humanity. I hope you enjoy this week. You take care. Bye-bye.